Alright, it's time for Power Drift. So, this was one of those Sega Super Scalar arcade games with a bunch of 3D sprites whipping around at crazy speeds. I think the arcade one was 60 frames a second, and it was full 3D. It wasn't like faked like Outrun or Super Hang-On. So what chance does the Commodore 64, a 1 MHz 8-bit system, have at recreating the thrills of this arcade classic? Well, we're about to find out. Okay, well, first off, I've got to admit, I'm playing this off my flash cart because it's so much more convenient than using discs, but these pictures are what it shows as it loads, and these are characters from the arcade game. So, okay, here we are, it's loaded up, and what you can see here is the 5 different courses you can choose from, which is pretty good for a Commodore 64 racing game. Okay, so if you've never played Power Drift before, here's the gist. It's a kart racing game, perhaps the first I played years before Mario Kart, even though it's not really that comparable other than being karts, but you have to complete 3 laps on a course, coming in 3rd or better place. Every cup has 5 different races, and they get increasingly difficult. So 5 different cups with 5 races each, that's 25 tracks. That's a lot for a game that fits entirely in the Commodore's memory, and it's a lot for an 8-bit racing game of the time. It also has some pretty cool music plus sound effects at the same time, which not every Commodore game did. You know, if you have a NES, you'll take that for granted. If you have a Commodore, you know, a lot of games were either music or sound effects, not both. So that's kind of cool. Unfortunately, you only get one song in this version of Power Drift, where the arcade version had, I think, 3 or 4 different tunes to choose from, kind of like an Outrun. I have to say, it's kind of funny how the car zipping by sound effect kind of cuts out a channel. It almost sounds like a cat's meow or something. It's kind of strange, but I guess it works. And that's the end of the first race. On to the next one. I gotta say, the graphics are pretty big and bold on this version of Power Drift. Like, look at the palm trees are quite big. The road is strangely undetailed, though, the road surface itself, even though there are hills, which, you know, not every racing game had. Making a road engine like Pole Position or Outrun on the Commodore is actually really hard, because it can't scroll as much as it needs to do a convincing road. So if you kind of watch this one, I think it's based on background tiles. It kind of boogies around to make these different road shapes. It's pretty interesting. Some other approaches were like Outrun, where they just animated the road and then scrolled the whole screen left and right as you steered, which looked kind of weird. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that game engine-wise, Power Drift did a great job, and this engine got reused, I believe, in the game Turbocharged, which is more like Road Blasters, and I think that one is actually a bit better as a game than this conversion of Power Drift. And you know, it's not like there's anything really wrong with this conversion of Power Drift, it just was never as good of a game as Outrun or Super Hang-On, in my opinion. So when you convert it and you lose all the really cool graphics that make the game what it is, you're left with a somewhat dull racer. And it doesn't really help that the game just plays slower than the original, because the original game had you really blowing around these race courses, and I think every lap was far less than 1 minute in length. And it's not a NTSC versus PAL thing. I'm playing this on NTSC, so this is as fast as Power Drift goes on the Commodore. And I'm not trying to single out the Commodore version. I mean, there are ports of this to the TurboGrafx, you know, the PC Engine. There's a port to the Spectrum, which I'm getting in the mail soon, so I can check that out. There's Amiga ports, ST ports. None of them, in my opinion, really capture what made the arcade version so magnetic. Really, the way to play Power Drift at home is to grab the Sega Saturn version, which is fantastic. There's also a Dreamcast port, which is quite good too. Yeah, as criticized as the Commodore port of Outrun was, I think I would actually rather play that. Outrun just came off better, I think, when you take away the graphics, but gameplay-wise, I think Outrun is a really high bar, so that's maybe a little bit unfair. What I will say is that there are a few racing games I would recommend on the Commodore 64 ahead of this one. Buggy Boy or Speed Buggy comes to mind. I think that's my absolute favorite on the system. I also quite enjoy the Great American Cross Country Road Race, which is a spiritual successor to Enduro on the Atari. That's a great game, albeit one that's pretty simple, but very replayable. And for just pure arcade racing, I really like Superbikes, even though that has its own, share of issues. And Pit Stop 1 and 2 by Epix, which, again, not perfect, but I think they're really fast and fun games, especially Pit Stop 2 in 2-player mode. That's a really good one. I think one thing that causes me to be a bit unenthused about this version of Power Drift is the collisions are a little bit unpredictable. Sometimes you tap a car and you go into a spin, other times you kind of go right through them like a ghost. I am glad though that you can still fall off of the edge of the track when it's raised, just like in the arcade one. I do see how this game would have been kind of a big deal to have on your Commodore back in the day. It's just that in 2016, what version of Power Drift are you really going to want to play, nostalgia aside? I would probably go for the Sega Saturn one. Plus that one has remixes of the music, which is a pretty cool thing to throw in. So that pretty much wraps up Power Drift. It's kind of neat, but I really do think there are better alternatives out there these days. Or even just other racing games on the Commodore. But, I'd be interested to see what you think. Any Power Drift fans or fans of this version of Power Drift? Yeah, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you.